Well, I'm really excited to recap the book from the month of April. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation between us all. I think, there's a lot of interesting points that were brought up in this book, and different perspectives on them will be really beneficial for everyone in keeping the conversations going. So, yeah, let's dive on into it. How did everyone enjoy the book?
I know Ben had some mixed feelings.
Yeah, maybe I'll go last. Do you want to go first, Jess, as was your recommendation?
I want to just like briefly touch on things and then like kind of see how it unfolds. But I don't want to go word vomit on you. I mean, look, as I kind of I think said to you guys when we first talked about reading it was um mixed reviews on myself. I have a very interesting take on the body positivity, um, fat liberation whole thing that's very like prominent in today's society. Um, I believe this book is like doing more good than harm. But it talks. I think it's good having the workbook and having talking points, and it's creating a conversation, which is really good. I think it's some of the stuff used to be quite taboo, so creating a platform and a place where people can open up and start discussions. I always do a bit of research on books before we hop in here to see what like the world kind of view is. And so it was really interesting when I was doing some of that in preparation for today is I could barely find anything negative, which was really interesting. But what I found was there's a lot more, a lot of people reading it in their own book club. So I was like, well, that's cool. Like people are getting into it and starting a conversation. But on the other side of the coin, I think normalizing things like obesity and being overweight, and I think there's a difference between body positivity. You can be a really good mother and friend and partner, and you can be all these a really good human, but just because you're overweight, like that doesn't take away from it. But I think people are confusing and crossing the lines, like with like Lizzo and things, for example. She's talking about loving yourself, and you can love yourself, but you can also still want to work on your things. And I think people who have a big platform like that are part of the issue with it becoming a negative thing, and understanding, oh well, whoever is that big or that obese, and I'm just gonna eat Kit Kats all day because they love themselves, and that's okay. And especially with women, not women, but men as well, but in the young demographic of having social media these days, I think can be a bit confusing. So those are just a few little niblets I have. So I'll let someone else go.
Yeah, no, that gets me excited for the rest of conversations to come. Laura, how did you find the book?
Probably similarly to you, Jess. I felt like overall I got a lot from it in terms of like starting to get my thought process going and starting to get a lot of like different things going in my head. And I think with the body positivity movement, my goal is to do a little bit more listening, because it's not something I have as much like personal experience with. So I think this was a really good way to understand some other people's perspective, understand what some people with different bodies have gone through. And to your point, I think opening up the conversation is really beneficial, because that's the only way we're going to hear these other perspectives. And there's a quote, and I'm not going to get it quite right, but it's something along the lines of, as you go through these topics, you're like, it's normal to expect things to be uncomfortable and to say things incorrectly, but that doesn't mean you stop. And I think that resonated with me a lot. And I hope this book I can continue those conversations in my life. And even if I can't get it right all the time, it's still continuing to do it, and learning from other people, and listening to those other perspectives.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. And, there was a lot of, I guess, talk as well in the book, kind of paralleling body positivity and fat shaming and all that to racism. And I think, some of those parts really frustrated me, because I do think that they're very different in some senses. But I think what is underlying that is similar is, like you said, Laura, we can't necessarily understand someone else's perspective if we're not there ourselves or haven't been there ourselves too, right? And specifically as, you know, coaches and professionals in the health and wellness industry, you know, it's important to make sure that our communities are inclusive, and that we make everybody feel comfortable and try our best to be empathetic for, you know, everyone's situation. So yeah, that's my little intro. But Ben, let's hop on over to you.
Yeah, so I think I had this book read probably within about 3 days, and I honestly have been thinking about how I would articulate what I thought about this book for the last 27. And like even like before I get into the conversation, like I'm almost a little bit nervous because for me the book, like the body positivity element was only one piece of, I think, some very pretty intense conversations preluding that about gender and race and sexual orientation. And I almost feel like, even before I say anything that I say is almost going to be like, of course you would say that because you're white, male, middle class, like blah, blah, blah. So there's a few things that I almost want to say as like you know, to kind of get out of the way first, is that like, I think when you are 4 white people sitting down to discuss some of these topics, like there is always going to be that level of uncomfortability. But just because we can't necessarily relate to the story or the experience of the author doesn't invalidate our experiences and kind of our opinions that we have, right? And I think that if we're truly going to change as a community, as a society, and break down a lot of these barriers, then it can't be oh, you don't understand, you'll never relate, and that's the end of the conversation. We need to believe that just because we can't relate directly, that we can still be empathetic within the conversation. Because if I can't understand you, if you're not willing to work with me to understand you, then, you know, chances are that I'm just going to be like, then it's too hard, right? And ultimately, if you're, you know, speaking from the place of a minority or someone who feels, you know, oppressed, the reality is, if it's going to change, you're going to have to get us on board, but we're going to have these conversations, and you're going to have to get us to understand, right? And so for me, that kind of, and I know that sounds like you have to do the work and it's your fault and you have to make me understand. And that's not what I mean at all. But what I mean is, like, I can't relate to a lot of what the book's kind of talking about. And I'm actually, for that reason, like, I did enjoy the book on a lot of levels, because I thought, like, wow, this is my first foray into some of these, you know, situations and topics. But for me personally, there's a Kanye quote in his song Power where he says, they say I'm the abomination of Obama's nation, and that's a pretty fucked way to start the conversation, right? And that kind of quote stuck with me because I think it's in the epilogue of the book. I kind of felt like the first like 2 paragraphs was like, and it's because of like the white supremacist, capitalist, like patriarchy that like this is a situation. And I kind of feel it's a little bit like that. It's like, we haven't even sat down to like have this conversation yet, and already I feel like you're putting a lot on me that I don't understand, you know? So kind of, I almost felt like from the outset of the book, like I was trying really hard to like Laura said, like listen and try to understand. But at the same time, there were things in there where I was like, that, like, I don't agree at all. Like, I don't agree with that. And I think Jess, probably from a similar line of view, I felt like, to put it in Canadian terms, I was at a baseball game and you're like watching the batter, and the batter would like hit a home run. You're like, yeah, she nailed it. Like, on that particular point, she nailed it. And then comes back out for like the next point and completely strikes out. I'm like, how is she like hitting and like knocking one out of the park and then just like completely missing? And I think maybe, again, that's got to do with more where I feel like I have a little bit of understanding and a little bit of experience. So for me, the stuff that she talked about in terms of body positivity when it comes to like ableism and her friends that were suffering from like disabilities and the struggles that they go through, and that sort of stuff, I was like, wow, like that's really powerful stuff I've never thought of. I completely agree with that. I think in particular, she's talking about her friend with cerebral palsy who might be pregnant. And she's talking about how, because she had cerebral palsy, and she has this thing about intimacy, she thought like intercourse with this guy was already hard enough and challenging enough, that then having a conversation about using contraception was just going to make everything way too hard. So she felt like she couldn't have that conversation because of her condition. And that like really kind of was like a very like a sad moment, right? Like I wonder how many people really do go through that. But the stuff like Jess said with the body positivity about morbid obesity, really, right? Like, I don't think anyone's having a conversation where we're saying you can't feel comfortable in your own skin or that health has to be a particular size. But I think there are definite issues with like being the kind of size where you need 2 seats on an airplane, right? And I think if we look at the book from a point of view that health is an economic issue that needs dealing with in marginalized communities, I think there's a lot more of a conversation to be had there, and a productive conversation to be had there, than to kind of go off on this tangent where it's like succumbing to my every will is my idea of self-love. And I don't agree with that at all. I think that part of self-love is things like self-discipline, right? It is things like doing things that make you uncomfortable, that you don't really feel like doing, or kind of sacrificing that immediate return on what you want for a goal that you're working forward to later on. And particularly when we understand that like food is so like heavily chemically engineered to make it over addicting. And she talks about like loving, like, and this is terrible, but she talks about like loving Twinkies and stuff as well. And when she says that, like, part of me is like, I think a lot of the reason that you're in the position as you're in is not necessarily because you were born to be the size that you are, but because of the decision-making process that you run through, right? And this has been a super long like entry, but there's like I think there's a lot of my idea of self-love is a lot more of like taking personal responsibility for my situation and understanding that my situation is an exact reflection of all the decisions I've made, good or bad, indifferent, up to this point. And if I'm not happy with where I am, I need to look at my decision making and start to change some of those decisions in order to change the trajectory that I'm on. And I didn't get that from the book. What I got from the book was, this is me, and we need to accommodate that this is me. Like, it's on kind of everyone else to accommodate that this is me because I refuse to apologize for it, right? Which on one element is great. Be you. I want you to be you. I want you to be the person that you want to be. And I don't think that, you know, you need to be a specific size to be valid or have an opinion or be heard or be listened. But I do think that, like anything, it's on a spectrum, right? And I think it gets to a point where it needs to be like, yeah, like I said, like you need to take a lot of responsibility for this, because being like super big and super overweight, like at the end of the day, ultimately, we know it's not healthy. That's maybe why we see in a lot of those marginalized communities that like life expectancy is so much lower. And again, if we have the conversation from an economic and a health standpoint about like, it's super hard to eat well when like you're feeding a lot of fat, like a lot of mouths, and it's super cheap to eat super processed food. That's a conversation I can get involved in and have a look at like, what can we do to try to change that? But thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
And I think you're right. I mean, Maggie kind of touched on it too, is like when she was like, you know, comparing, for example, like being born fat, like being born Black or white or Hispanic. Like that's where, like you said, like struck out. I was like, you know, like you said, everything is a choice, and all the choices you've made in your life lead you up to this point now. And so, yeah, like that was like, it makes me almost switch off and not hear other things she says when things like that are discussed. And I fully disagree. Yeah. Anyways, that was just my little 2 cents on your part.
Thanks.
Yeah. And Ben, I think, you know, you kind of brought up the fact, or this point, which I agree with. And I think a large part of the talk about body positivity and fat shaming and everything that the author did discuss, it was almost like she was framing it as a systemic issue of how fat people are treated, or, you know, being called fat or whatever it may be, when really I think the systemic issue stems from what is causing people to become overweight and unhealthy. And, you know, maybe the blame is being distributed in a non-optimal way, or, you know, maybe we're not focusing on what the actual, you know, problem is and how we can fix that. That's something that I kind of stuck with me throughout the book as well.
There's like, I completely agree with what she says about like health doesn't have a size, right? Like, it's not like you have to be a size 6, or you have to be, you know, if you're 6 foot, 180 pounds, and you know, we want to see that 6-pack come through. And I think, especially as coaches, that we understand that like that is not in no way your leanness is an indicator of how healthy you are. And ultimately, I guess the discussion is, we could argue that's too far the other way. And there's probably a lot of psychological metrics that we'd want to look at with someone who was only chasing those kind of goals and was trying to hold at that point too, right? Like, you can go too far the other way as well. And we're saying I think that maybe that's the point, is what we're saying is, we don't, just because we don't want you here, that doesn't mean we want you all the way over there too, right? Like, we're kind of bring in both ends and meet somewhere in the middle, where we have positive biometrics that suggest your health is in good shape. There's nothing overly alarming that's going on, but two, that your social circle is something that you can engage in and that you feel comfortable. Like, and again, we don't want you drinking every night, but I also don't want you not drinking because you're terrified to drink, right? So there's always this like give and take. And a lot of what I got from the book was that, no, like, I refuse to take responsibility, but like, if it was meant to be, it would be, and it's obviously not meant to be, and therefore, like, damn society for making me feel like it should, is kind of like the gist that I got from it.
The piece that I found interesting, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts, because I don't think I landed on something, but the idea that the more shame and like criticism we put around people in bigger bodies, the less empowered they feel to make changes because of that level of shame and kind of spiral type situation. I don't know how I felt about it, so I'm curious what you guys think.
Jess? I feel like I've done a lot of talking and not very good articulating. Even as I'm saying it, I'm like, this is not how it sounded in my head.
Yeah. You mean in terms of like society bringing shame upon people for, yeah. Man, it's so hard because I feel like, so this book, I'll take a step back. This book for me, so I was a husky kid, right? Like, I've never been, I wouldn't say obese, but it actually brought up a weird memory for me that I think buried somewhere back in my subconscious, of being slightly overweight as a child, I guess, and being at the doctor's with my mom and remembering the doctor saying to my mother, if she tells you she's hungry, make her drink 2 large glasses of water first. And I don't know why that came up, but I like can now just vividly picture it. And I think one of the big issues is the men in lab coats that we go to for all of our medical things tend to not have vulnerability, create a safe and open space. And it's just like, they see it as, this is the problem and this is what you need to do, without creating a conversation or having any candor about it. So, it might make the person feel bad instead of having the conversation from a place of love. I think that's probably a big part stems from. And it just like, I was so weird because I was like, whoa, I was like, that's hectic. I was like, and I can never remember my mom doing that, which is great. But I think that's part of it because, in our society today, we still go to the doctor for most things. And I just think it's so unaccepted to become slightly overweight or to put on some weight. And not that it should or shouldn't be accepted, but how it's handled. And I just think there's deeper meanings, as you guys would probably all know, and what you do with nutrition coaching is there's different reasons than just, not moving enough and eating too much, the trauma that underlies that, or the emotional attachment. I just think that it goes so much more further than surface level. And I think sometimes either not just doctors, but people just don't understand, sometimes I think it's easy. I'm sure we've all been there and, seen someone on a plane or something who takes up too much space, and you think, fuck, like that's that must be so uncomfortable. Like, and I used to try and, you watch Biggest Loser or something and you're like, I can't imagine. Like I struggle to ever think about how I could ever get to a position like that. So like I think you said in the beginning, Laura, it's hard to relate. So I think it's got to start with it's got to start from the top down, and people just have to start, I guess, creating that open, vulnerable conversation of the deep why, that 7 questions of why we do the things we do and where we're at. So that's my take.
I think almost the body positivity movement almost comes across as like a protective measure, right? Like it's almost like it's easier to push the body positivity line than it is to say, I'm not quite sure how I got in this position and I'm uncomfortable with it, but I'm also not quite sure like how to get out of it, right? And I think ultimately my take on kind of where we are as a community when it comes to these issues is I believe that we're in the positions we're in because of the lack of knowledge and education that's out there, and because of, you know, like the industry that we're in, it's full of bullshit. And I have no doubt that there are a ton of people out there that are very overweight and they might be, you know, they might love the person they are, but they feel like they're not able to be the person all that they could be because of their weight holds them back. And I guess the passion for MTMM is to reach those people and say, like, here's some credible and useful information that like will actually help, you know. And we're not saying that you have to take this journey, but if it's something that you want to do, these are kind of some of the things that you can think about doing, right? Because no doubt there's a ton of people out there who have been dieting for 10 or 15 years, right? And it's when you get to that point, yeah, obviously it's going to get to a, you know, we always talk about trying to avoid the fuck it moment, right? Where you're like, it's too hard. I've tried for the last 10 or 15 years. Nothing I do seems to work. I seem to be propelling backwards. So what's the point? You know, I may as well just kind of accept my fate, right? And I think that, yeah, a lot of that comes from, you know, I know, like I was a big kid. Like I remember hitting at my biggest, I think I was 19 years old and like 120 kilos. I'm only 6 foot tall. Like that's huge. And I was always like, I played footy and like had no real idea about diet, but neither did my family, you know? And I kind of remember having like getting home from school, like with my dad and be like 10 o'clock at night, because I'd go to his office after school and be like, the only thing my dad could cook was like pasta. And then it's 10 o'clock at night. So you're fucking hungry because you haven't eaten since like lunchtime at school. So what do? You have a huge plate of pasta and then you like go to bed, you know? And so there's that kind of, you know, when you are in those environments as a kid where, you know, ultimately you don't make any of the decisions surrounding, you know, especially as a younger kid, like what you're doing when you're shopping, no, then you shouldn't either because you're not really contributing, right? But I think that the lack of education there kind of stems down and it kind of, it's like this generational thing, right? But I think we do also live in a time where processed food is so heavily available, like the industrial revolution and what it's done to food and availability. And, you know, and given the way technology is going, yeah, it is easier than it's ever been to overconsume and more tempting than it's ever been to be underactive. And again, like it's not like, it's like Jess said, it's not, you need to eat less and exercise more, but it is about being aware of the kind of lifestyle and the choices that you're making regularly. And you don't wake up at 265 pounds. It's every day for a considerable period of time that happens, right? And then, yeah, you do get to a moment where you look in the mirror and you're like, how the fuck did I get here? Like, how am I here? And it's the same thing going back the other way. You got to be prepared if it's something that you want to do. You got a long ass journey ahead of you, and it's not, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and feel immensely different or immensely changed. But to that point too, if you don't deal with the psychological, you're not going to wake up at 185 and all your problems have been solved either, right? Like there's both that's got to kind of come into it. But I think personally, the first step is to, yes, it's to take responsibility and have the courage to like admit that I'm not happy with the position physically that I'm in, and I'm willing to start to do a bit of work on correcting that, right?
And I think on that, just kind of building on the last thing you said there, like taking responsibility to make the changes you want to see is one thing, but feeling like you are responsible for where you have ended up, I think is another thing. And I think that's not necessarily where we want that thought to go is, okay, it's my fault that I am where I am. Because like we have been discussing, there's a lot of issues with in terms of like lack of education and knowledge around food and what's available out there and affordable and all that sort of thing as well. So I think, you know, when we say take responsibility, it's more so for making the changes we want to see rather than take responsibility for where you've ended up. Because that's where I feel like that idea of shame comes in, and then it is really hard to reach out for help, you know, acknowledge that there's an issue, and, you know, find that safe space. So yeah, I just wanted to tack that on.
No, that's so true. I mean, when you said you were having pasta, I was like, we were having cinnamon toast crunch for breakfast, which is basically cinnamon sugar. It's a dessert. Like I can't even, it's crazy. And so it is tough. Like, I think you're right. Like, the childhood obesity rates and, 2 out of 3 people having type 2 diabetes. And, it's now not called late onset. It's now like, it's just type 2 diabetes. It can happen at any time. It's pretty wild. But I think going back to Ben's point is like having a conversation around the economics and poverty and, like subsidizing some sort of healthy system or taxing junk food, or I don't know what the answer is, but, I think that's a big part of it and what needs to be addressed first.
I like the idea too, that they talked about in terms of like not judging health by weight. And I had kind of like the opposite. So as a kid, I was like super underweight. Like you could see my ribs, like went to the doctors, like, and the reason is the doctor kept being like, she needs more weight. They told my parents to give me shakes with heavy whipping cream in them. And I'm lactose intolerant. And like my stomach, I'm not kidding, like hurt for years, like years. And every time I went to the doctor, no one took it seriously because they're like, oh, she's healthy, she's fine, she's, whatever weight. And like, I think a lot of people over the years have looked back at pictures of me at, 10, 12, 15. And like, I had abs, I was skinny, and people are like, oh, this is great. Like, this is healthy. Yeah. And like, so on both ends of the scale, I think it's true as well, right? Is like, just, you can't judge someone's internal health by how they look. And like, let's stop looking at a body and making an assumption about their health. Let's let their health be between them and their practitioner. And let's worry about other parts of them. And to your point at the beginning, Jess, like acknowledging all the things that they are and kind of leaving your judgments on their body and appearance kind of at the door.
I think the conversation that, sorry, Jess, do you want to go?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, to your point about being, if we were glorifying women who were terribly anorexic, I think it'd be a different conversation. It would just be different, but that's all I was going to say.
Yeah. I think part of the conversation that gets left out a lot when it comes to body positivity is it's not just a physical conversation. Like we need to have more conversations around like the mental health aspect of it and really start to understand, like, if you're going to fulfill your potential and be the person that you want to be, we need to talk and understand about like what confidence is. Like we all know as coaches, like confidence is like the X factor in the achievement of anything, right? You need to believe in yourself that you're capable of doing what it is that you're setting out to do, right? And I think that, and this is a conversation Mags and I have almost daily, is that what confidence is an understanding of what your values are as a person. If you understand what your values are, then you understand what drives your decision-making process. And if you understand what's driving your decisions and what's informing your decisions, and you believe your decisions are aligned with what you hold dearest to you, your values, then you're confident. And it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. It doesn't matter what size you are. It doesn't matter how much you weigh, because those values and those decisions are aligned. There's less internal conflict and you start to buy in and believe what you're about. And when you buy in and believe what you're about, that's when the magic happens, right? So once we get to that level, you can have conversations with people about changing their health status or whatever it is by understanding and addressing that, hey, look, these are your top 3 values and that's great, but we need to see where your health fits into this conversation and what can we do to start to bring health up a little bit in that metric of your value system. If I can get health into your top 3 or 4 values, even for the next 5 or 6 years, that's all I need to do. Because if you agree and you buy into that, it will come out in your decision-making process. And if we have an understanding where when you're faced with a choice of indulging now or achieving a long-term goal, or when you're choosing between left and right, or soda or water, whatever it is, all those kind of small, if you understand and you believe and you buy in that health is part of that value system, you automatically make better decisions over a prolonged period of time. And it's that, like, when we talk about what your body is supposed to look like, let's give it the best tools that it can and see what the body has to do. And for some of us, myself included, like, I'm gonna sit heavier. Like some of us are gonna sit heavier and be a little bit softer than ultimately we feel like we need to do it. And that's okay. Like I'm okay with that. Like I don't need to be 5% walking around anymore. And for a long time, I felt like I needed to. For a long time, I felt like to have an opinion that was heard and valid in this industry, I needed to be 5% and shredded all the time, or what the fuck do I know what I'm talking about, right? So when it comes to like, I almost want to call like mind positivity, right? Like if you can understand your value system and that infiltrates your decision-making process, that's confidence. And once you're confident, like now we actually see what you're capable of and how your body transforms, following how your mind's transformed, right? And maybe Lizzo will always, like maybe she's the same as me. She's always going to be like, she's never going to be walking out there, like, and she doesn't have to. It doesn't make her any better of a performer or any better of a human being because she's like gone through this, big transformation. But it would be interesting to have a chat with, some of these people and see sort of on this list of your top 3 priorities, like, where is your health, and show me where that comes into the decisions that you're making on a daily basis,
Mm-hmm. And I think, prioritizing your health is one thing, and then being able to action that is another thing that I think comes back to the psychological side, right? Looking at things like self-sabotage or whatever it may be, that is, really making it difficult to make the decisions that are going to align with, your priority of health. And then that can lead to a whole, array of psychological issues as well, or struggles. If you're not aligned, like your actions are not aligned with what you're saying your values are. I think that's something that I've taken from Brene Brown.
Change of any kind is like super challenging, right? Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if you're looking to make a pretty monumental change, it's going to be pretty monumentally uncomfortable, right? And take it from someone who's been 120 kilos, like running is hard at 265 pounds. It is challenging. Your fucking knees hurt, your ankles hurt, like everything hurts. You're uncomfortable. You can't breathe for shit, right? But it's like, it just gets to a point where you just have to be comfortable with that it's going to be uncomfortable, right? And then you find CrossFit, which is like every single workout all the time is uncomfortable, but you just kind of learn to sit in that fire and understand, like, if this is what I want to achieve, like this is part of that deal, and I either do or I don't, right?
Jess, did you post that choose your hard thing?
Yeah.
Was that, yeah, that's what and I really like that. I like that idea of like, it's empowering you, like choose which hard you would like to do.
Making a decision is hard. So like it talked about, being in a relationship is hard. Having a divorce is hard. Choosing to eat healthy. Like it was just kind of about basically everything in life is hard, but you got to choose, working out is hard, but so is also not working out. Like I'm a big believer in I've probably seen on my Instagram is like doer of hard things, because I just think the more often that you choose hard, without making a detriment to too much, is like the more resilience and grit and things you build along the way. Like Ben said, sitting in the ring of fire, every CrossFit workout, like every CrossFit workout sucks, but it's also so awesome. And I think going back to like your mental health, it's like, it's hard to choose the hard thing, but doing hard things and creating the resilience and the grit and, getting to where you want to go becomes easier when it becomes a habit as well. So we're also reading in our team book club, we're reading Atomic Habits. And so, which just reinforces for like the 3rd time, which is great. But it just reinforces like resilience and even like how you're born and things. These are not always, it's not something that you like automatically get because your mom or your dad might have it. Like it becomes a skill and becomes something that you have to work on every single day. And sometimes those choices aren't always easy, but I think like the more you can, choose, maybe not all the time, it's not 100% thing. Like we're all, human. And sometimes I like the easy thing of Netflix and chill. So I get it. But I think the more often that you can choose it in that 80 kind of 20% context, the better your life will be. And from a health perspective is like making the hard decision of having healthier food and moving a bit more and, dealing with your trauma and stuff like that. It's going to give you better quality of life, longer life, healthier life, less disease and stuff down the track. But I think it's difficult. because you don't see that, you don't see the long game all the time. You know, we see things in, 5 foot in front of us. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think those hard decisions too become easier once you start to notice the effects that they're having, whether it be on your physical, mental health, whatever it is. But say, for example, like going to the gym, doing a hard workout, that sort of thing. Like, yeah, it's going to suck and it's going to take a little while for you to start to notice the benefits that it's providing you. But once you start to notice that, there's a bit more momentum there as well, I think. But that starting point is what's really difficult.
I guess it's also another point of privilege too, right? When you talk about like CrossFit, and we kind of had like the chat, we touched on like the economics when it comes to health, and ultimately like there are going to be barriers for some people of what actually making the kind of that decision is. But I think there's almost a little bit of like too, if there's a will, there's a way, right? Like it doesn't cost you anything to go for a run, or it doesn't cost you anything to go down the park and start working on some chin-ups on the monkey bars, or going for a walk, or whatever it is. Like it doesn't have to be anything heroic, but yeah. I mean, look, and I guess to tie it all the way back to the book too, like there were so many levels and so many topics of discussion that we could almost do 4 or 5 of these. But I think for me, and obviously for all of us, like that element of body positivity, like I think you hit the nail on the head there, Jess, earlier on when you said like you don't get to choose your race, or you don't get to choose your sexual orientation, but like you do have a control over like the decisions that you make, and ultimately which direction you go when faced with those decisions. So yeah,
love it. I knew this would be a good discussion.
Honestly, like I said, I read the book in like 3 days, and I messaged Mags and I was like, I love that I don't love it, but it will be interesting to see how we go in the conversation, because I think particularly, like I said earlier, like 4 white people like sitting down to discuss like the opinions of someone who clearly feels like oppressed and marginalized by the society in which, like, this is a very hard and uncomfortable conversation to have. And like I said before, I think it's great that we're reading things like this, because here we are forced to have a conversation about it, and like I said before, that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to necessarily relate to Renee's life experience, right? Renee Taylor, right? It was Renee Taylor. Yeah. We're not going to be able to necessarily relate to her life experience or the things that she's been through, but hopefully hearing the story and paying attention and listening to it allows us to be a little bit more empathetic when, dealing with people who can relate to that story or are in similar situations, and then how we try to provide support and how we try to provide guidance, and that it's done in a way that takes into account, like, yeah, it's not super easy for everyone just to go and choose the healthy option and spend 2 hours, 2 classes doing CrossFit and stuff like that, right?
The other thing it made me notice, it talked a bit about like your own self-talk, or like having positive self-talk, and it made me notice things that I think or say to myself, but also what others say to themselves. When you're like, oh man, you're looking great, or whatever, yeah, or like those pants, right. And like no, like I look so shit, like these are shit, and you're just like, ooh, like it just was like a little bit, like I was just a bit more in tune to it with like my clients and people in general, but I was like, oh, self-love, we need some self-love here. But it just sparks that conversation, and now being able to be like, oh, okay, well, just tells me a little bit about them and what's going on in their head. Which is interesting.
Yeah, I think regardless of like gender, race, size, like everyone's definitely fighting a battle, like everyone's got their demons, everyone's got their trauma. How that manifests for some people is going to be, I guess, in like physical appearance, right? But everyone's got some healing to do and some work to do on themselves. And I think, there's that expression like hurt people, right? But I also think that like healed people heal people. And I think that ultimately, like the more work that, again, you take responsibility to confront and be uncomfortable with and face down some of these like demons and issues of self-doubt and self-belief and self-confidence, like the more you're actually going to be able to empower those around you to do the same thing. And I say to my clients a lot when they start to get disheartened, like, you never know who you're accidentally inspiring, right? Especially with things like social media. And I fucking hate social media. I rag on it a lot, but there is obviously a positive, element to it as well. And you just never know who like follows Jess, because it's like the fact that she's doing all these different things actually makes me believe that maybe I can go out there and do something different that I've never tried before, or who follows Laura to see like how to start learning how to cook and be a bit more adventurous in the kitchen, or watches Maggie like go and do these hikes in the mountains and stuff like that. And it's like, you can't quit because you don't know who's relying on you that you don't even know about, and I think if, given the self-talk message, if we spoke to ourselves a little bit more like that and maybe take it off ourselves, but put on, being there for others and use that as a motivational factor, like, fuck, now I can't quit. Now I got to stay the course. Now I got to keep, showing up and fronting up and kind of putting my money where my mouth is.
It's like that quote where they say like, you would never like speak to someone else the way you speak to yourself.
Yeah.
Oof. Check yourself.
Ben Bergeron used to have this thing where he's like, imagine your inner monologue is hooked up to your PA system at your gym. Like, would you like your members like hearing how you talk, and if it's not good enough for them, why is it good enough for you? And if you wouldn't talk to a stranger like that, why are you talking to yourself like that? It's like, right in the feels.
There was a point she made on self-love as well, that it's a muscle that you keep practicing and working on. And I liked that as well. I think sometimes I hear these ideas of like, you love yourself in every moment, and it seems like such a monumental thing of like, how will I ever get there, especially if you're at a place where it's more times than not you're not feeling great about yourself. And I think by remembering that it's a practice and a daily thing that you can do and kind of make those smaller steps towards, makes it seem, or at least to me, a lot more attainable and doable, and something that's like digestible.
It might be worth touching on too that not every drive or desire to improve or change has to come because you don't like who you are or what position you're in. Like, you can be perfectly content with the person that you are, but still want to strive and see what you're capable of, right? And I think that when it comes to things like health and self-development, the beauty of it is that there's no finish line. There's always more that you can do, and there's always a little bit further. And once you climb one mountain, it just kind of shows you that you're capable of climbing that mountain. So now what's the next mountain that you're going to start working on climbing, right? And I think sometimes with the part of that body positivity movement, I think people maybe feel like they're trapped because they've put out all this kind of like content in terms of like, yes, this is me, and this is, like you almost build in your size as part of your identity. Right. And if you change your mind one day and you feel like, actually, I'm uncomfortable, like, how do you then reconcile with the person you believe you are if you all of a sudden want to make a change? Right. And so I think that yeah, we want to make sure that it's not like, hey, you need to change and that's a punishment for where you're in, but it's okay to be comfortable with who you are and still want to improve in whatever area it is. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important part.
Thanks, Mags.
Okay, maybe we can try this again, but does anybody have any closing thoughts, final thoughts, anything that maybe we've taken from this discussion that's maybe changed your view on something from the book, or anything like that?
I think it's a stark reminder of how many different kind of backgrounds do make up our community. And if we're serious about improving community health, then that's an aspect that we really do need to take into consideration, right? And I think it's easy to fall into the trap of confirmation bias. Like, if I look around my friendship group, like, we're all pretty much the same,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a good reminder that there are people out there that have very, very different upbringings to what I've had, have very, very different opinions on the world, and have very different goals and metrics of what they define as success. And I think ultimately, if we're going to grow as a community, like, all those voices need to be heard and represented. But it does stem from like being able to have conversations like this, where it's like, okay, hey, I'm going to put my foot in my mouth at some point here, but like, know that that's not my intent, and this is actually what I'm trying to say,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. I think my closing remarks, I'm going to pull in a quote that reminded me of a lot of the Brene Brown work that I've read as well. And it was, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. So I think, just taking that back into our daily practice and obviously more professional practices too, it's just not that idea of shaming people for where they're at currently is not going to help anyone get to where they want to be, or if they are ready to make a change, it's not going to help, get them to make that change. So that was kind of my biggest takeaway from the book and Renee's story too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think my takeaways are similar to you, Maggie, and maybe to like add slightly on it. I think the place that what I really want to take going forward is that idea of like having those conversations and listening to those other perspectives, whether I can relate or not. That idea of like, I hear you, tell me more, and wanting to listen and truly like hear what people have to say about their experience, how they've lived, and not kind of putting my own thoughts and judgments on them. I think from a broad range of topics. So that's kind of my takeaway.
Love all of that taken away for myself. But I love what Ben said about like, I believe hurt people, but healed people heal people. Which I was like, oh, fucking light bulb, amazing. But it's been good because I've actually recently been thinking about how to use my social media platform for a bit more good in terms of talking about some things that maybe make me feel uncomfortable. I try and avoid all of this conflict. I'm like, I'll just be in the middle. I'm the gray person, like the snippets of people's opinions. So it just isn't a conversation. And I think that's kind of where people get fired up and caught up in, instead of like having an open forum and going, okay, I'm going to do an Instagram live and I'm going to come to me with your questions or troubles or issues or comments and let's chat about it or whatever. Cause it just makes it so, I don't know, so like one-sided, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like it's everything on that spectrum that we sort of mentioned earlier. Right. And I think that, you believe one thing, I believe another. Probably what's going to be best is somewhere in the middle. Right. And I think that we need to stop defending our points so vigorously that, we feel like we can't succumb or we can't change our mind. And it's like if you can present with me enough evidence or enough of an argument that makes me consider something from a different point of view, I have to be open to the fact that you might be able to change my mind. And if we're all open to the fact that we could possibly be wrong and that someone else might be right for a change, like I think the conversation evolves much faster. And I think you both then take a lot from that conversation and you have that meeting point in the middle. But we become such a like, you're left or you're right or you're this or you're that. And it's like, what about this space here? You don't have to be vegan or carnivore. Like there is fucking room here for like the negotiation and probably the best thing and the most practical approach for many, of the issues or of the problems that were brought up in the book is somewhere in that middle,
Yeah. Yeah. So a little tidbit on that, kind of off topic. There's Brené Brown interviewed Adam Grant on her Dare to Lead podcast on Spotify. I don't know if you guys heard it. Anyways, his book is called Rethinking. It's super. I listened to his book. It's like only like 5 or 6 hours, but it's basically about how to have conversations on tough topics. So veganism or vaccines, but how to actually open the space up and open the door up to go, tell me more, like, and just, to rethinking. That's what it's about, is like how to like have conversations and try to understand people a bit better, but creating a space where it's not headbutting, but like a mutual ground. It's really interesting. Like I highly recommend listening to it. It's, you want to rethink, and it makes you rethink everything you think. You're like, why do I do this? And why do I think like this? And thanks mom and dad for that, or whatever. But it's quite interesting if you've got 5 or 6 hours to learn some stuff.
There's a podcast called Tell Me More that I listened to. And it's that idea. I don't remember. I think it's in one of the first episodes. The whole concept of it is that you don't come to the table trying to change each other's mind. You just come to the table to like share your point of view and see what you can learn from each side. And I think those are the productive conversations, because if you are trying to convince someone, then you're both in that defense mode and you're not going to absorb anything, versus if you come to the table sharing things and you can, start to listen to those points and say like, I may not agree with your whole piece, but I understand these pieces. That's where you can kind of, I think, find that middle ground.
Yeah.
Cool. Love that.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think we think too much about like, I'm right, you're wrong. and you know, again, like, how do you have conversations then about something that you're not a complete professional on, right? Like, and like, you can't just avoid those conversations. You can't go through life being like, this is the one thing I know about, so this is the only thing I'm ever going to talk about, because I think you'll stunt your growth, like, developmentally, right? But yeah, I think that, and you see it on social media all the time, and like, lockdown has probably just exacerbated it too. Like people that are anti-vax that I know didn't even pass like year 9 science. Like, really? Like that's kind of where you're going to take this big stand, you know? So, oh, here's Mags. Hey, she's back.
Sorry.
That's all right. But yeah, I think that it's like, conversation has become a lost art. Like we've literally lost the skill to sit down with someone and chat for an extended period of time, be okay with them presenting like a view that's different from ours, detach ourselves from our views and understand that like what I think not necessarily is my identity, and that I'm happy for you to change my mind. Those are, you know, we kind of live now in this like, well, isolated more so now than ever, but like this clickbait, you know, kind of approach to everything that we do. And it's like, Jess, if you can't, you know, maybe there's an element of truth in that. If you can't summarize what you think in X amount of time, then maybe you don't really understand it to the level that you do. But if you don't provide me with enough context and backing and understanding and how you got to that point, I'm not gonna be able to get to the same conclusion as you do without the same evidence, right? So, and that's like, two people looking at the same incident occurring can have very different like truths about what they've just seen occur based on a lot of those life experiences, right? So if we understand that even if you see exactly the same thing, that your version of what's occurred could be completely different and both are right, then how do we not take that approach into conversations about anything, you know, race, gender, body positivity? So I think this is my long way of saying thanks, guys, for giving me like the hour to like sit down and have like a prolonged conversation about some really like confronting and uncomfortable topics, and you know, some areas, and good book, Jess, like good book recommendation, you know, as much as we might say didn't love it and it was a very challenging read, like I guess the point was this conversation here that we've had, and kind of take away from it like the different lessons and the eye-opening that, you know, everyone's a little bit different, and hopefully we carry that forward into all of our kind of interactions over the next however long till we read the next book, and that changes us, and then the next one changes us a little bit more, right?
Right. Yeah, thank you very much, Jess. I enjoyed the book. Like, if we're looking at it, either I enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, I definitely enjoyed it, and I enjoyed this conversation even more. And that's the point of a book club, right?
The half of it that you were here for, Mags.
And thanks for taking over, Ben.
I think we might have missed a couple of minutes in the interim there, but yeah. Well, anyway.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone, and looking forward to sitting down again in a few weeks to recap May's read.